Hello and a very warm welcome to this presentation of the research paper Exploring Mental Models for Transparent and Controllable Recommender Systems, a Qualitative Study. My name is Thao. I'm a PhD student in psychology at the University of Duisburg-Essen, which is located in Western Germany. I did this interdisciplinary work together with my dear colleague Johannes Kunkel, who is a PhD student in computer science, and Professor Jürgen Ziegler, who is also a computer scientist. And I bet this is no news for you. Recommender systems are often perceived as intransparent. They are often perceived as black boxes by end users. So that means that for end users, it is often not apparent how the inner mechanisms of recommender systems work. Therefore, recent research efforts have focused on the increase of transparency and control, and this is where our research is also located. We asked, what do people actually know about the inner mechanisms of recommender systems, and how do they think certain recommendations are generated by the system? So the central question of this work was, what are users' mental models of recommender systems? And mental models are cognitive knowledge representations of technological systems. They have their roots in psychology and are also investigated in the field of human-computer interaction, where Don Norman has done some substantial work. So he distinguishes between the represented world, which is the world of objects and systems, and the so-called representing world, which is the simplification or abstraction of the other world. So mental models as knowledge representations are part of the representing world. So they are constructed, subjective, incomplete, and possibly inaccurate. So it's not so much about being specifically granular or technically correct, but more about being useful enough for the users to sufficiently use the system and predict certain outcomes of a system. There has been some work done in this field already. So there is some work that have investigated, for instance, the mental model of Google search, or other studies that have shown, for example, that increasing the soundness of mental models is beneficial for control. Other researchers have already claimed that mental models should be considered when developing transparent intelligent systems. And specifically in the field of recommender systems, there's one initial survey by Gori et al., who have asked about the user knowledge of recommender systems and concluded that they have a certain cognitive model, but they did not explicitly investigate mental models. So the four research question we have asked in this paper was, obviously, what are the mental models users hold of a recommender system? To what extent is the recommender system perceived as transparent and controllable? And what kind of implications can we derive from mental models for the design of recommender systems? And as mental models are subjective, we deemed a qualitative research approach is very appropriate to investigate these questions. And there are many methodologies in qualitative research. We've chosen the so-called grounded theory by Strauss and Corbin, which is a very, very exploratory approach, which is very, very data-driven. All the concepts emerge from the data. So what did we do? So we conducted semi-structured interviews, a think aloud task and a drawing task, where we asked people about the inner working of Netflix, which we used as an example for recommender systems. And we asked them, like, how do they think these systems work? How do certain recommendations are generated? Which data is used? And in grounded theory, the data collection and the data analysis is deeply intertwined. It's not sequential, but you do it basically at the same time. So it's an iterative process. And we did this process 3 times and sampled 10 participants. So we aim for sampling very typical, regular Netflix users. So all in all, we had 10 participants, which were rather young and were part of the typical Netflix user sample. an inherent part of qualitative research is the so-called coding, which is the analysis of the material. So here, two independent raters, so two people coded the whole material independently. So there were three coding methods used here. So the first one being the so-called open coding, where the raters independently coded relevant and striking aspect in the material. Here we used a lot of times so-called in vivo codings, which means that there were literal we use the literal expressions of the participants as a code. So this is a very good way to capture the participants' voices in the coding scheme. The next step was the so-called actual coding, where we try to connect and relate the codes from the open coding to each other and try to form categories out of them. So one example would be the category of data, which had 4 dimensions, namely the movie and user characteristics, as well as the user behavior and external data as different types of data that were mentioned by the participants. And finally, we applied the selective coding, which means that from all the categories and codes that have emerged in the second phase, we looked for the most and more important categories and themes that arises from the second step. So beside the mental models, there were also other very interesting themes, such as how does the user look for an item, or how does the user evaluate an item. So we had this data, we had a lot of drawings, we had a lot of textual data that we coded. What are the results? We found that there is a lack of transparency and control. It was nicely captured, for instance, by this participant. Some recommended movies I find interesting, but there are also many things I'm not interested in. I feel that my preferences don't play a role. Instead, it's just the movies which people are currently talking about. So here it is clear that the participant did not see any control in the recommendation process. It doesn't play any role which preferences this person had. This often came along with the concept that we have coined, the so-called mystification. So many times participants had some superstitions about how the recommendation process or how the inner mechanism was. So here, for instance, participant 2 expressed that there might be some information exchange, data exchange between Facebook and Netflix. Next, we found that a participant expressed clear ideas about user and item-based recommendations. So for instance, this is captured in this drawing also by participant 2, where 3 different movies have been watched by the participants and 2 of them were liked. So the 2 top ones were liked and the one on the bottom was not liked. And the recommendation, which is the box with the orange circle, was then recommended to the participant because that person liked the first and the second movie. We also found that people talked a lot about user-based recommendations, and this was also closely related to a concept we call transfer of mental models. So oftentimes participants expressed that they know about a different recommender system and then have transferred the knowledge of this platform on the one of Netflix. So for instance, here participant 9 reports, I could imagine that it is like, for example, at Amazon, there it is also written that users bought something together. So here, this person refers to the explanations Amazon gives about their recommendations, and then therefore it is perceived as more transparent and transferred to the use case of Netflix. Next, we found a very interesting concept, which is nicely captured in this quote. Okay, in my case, first of all, we need myself, the Netflix user. This is the respective drawing of this person, and she started with drawing herself, and then all the rest of the components around herself. So it's clear from her drawing and also her description that she herself as an individual user plays a major role in the process of Netflix and their recommendations. We coined this concept the centrality of self. Finally, we found various characteristics of the mental models, for instance, technical versus rather metaphorical mental models. So technical ones were more about procedure and processes. So the people often had a step-by-step idea of how the inner working of Netflix was, whereas others had a more of a metaphorical idea. So for instance, it's nicely captured in this quote: "It has all its tentacles, at each tentacle it offers its products, the movies it has. It's like a Kraken monster." So this is the drawing, and it also entails a very, very negative view on the platform, of course, because it's not a very positive thing to draw anything like a Kraken monster. Despite all these different models and characteristics, we found a very basic model underlying all the participants. So this model consisted of 4 steps. We have the first step is the acquisition of mostly implicit data. Then from this data, there is a virtual user profile inferred from. Then there's a comparison between the items or the user profiles and this virtual profile. And as the fourth and last step, there's a generation of recommendations that are returned to the user. So despite all the diverse mental models we found, this is the underlying basic model that we found. So in regards to this, the first question, research question, what mental models do users hold of recommender system? We conclude that there's this very, very basic model consisting of these steps, underlying all of them. Next, about the second and the third research question of transparency and control, we found that people perceive a lack of transparency and control, and therefore had ideas of mystification and the centrality of self, and transferred mental models from other platforms to the given one. Although we note that here in this study, we focused on a very specific sample, namely regular Netflix users and only Netflix, and we did not compare it with other recommender systems. So it's unclear how prevalent, for instance, this basic model is, and it would be a very interesting next step for future work to investigate and quantify mental models further. Regarding the last research question, the practical implications for the development of recommender systems, we suggest the following 3 things. So one is to link the components to existing mental models, which means that because of this basic mental model consisting of 4 steps, not every single step of a recommender system has to be describe and explain to a user. Maybe apparently it's enough to relate all these single steps to these 4 basic steps. Then the second, align the user interface components with recommendation systems, recommendation algorithms. And this relates to the user-based and item-based algorithms. So apparently there are already some existing ideas about user or item-based recommendation, and then it should be more explicitly visible to the user whether it is user or item-based recommendations. And then the third one, heed the centrality of self. So apparently many people had ideas about their individual role on the recommendation process. And it's helpful in order to avoid exaggerations or misconceptions to show how much indeed people have influence on the recommendation process and to what extent the own individual preferences play a role in this. So all in all, these 3 steps relate to the idea to align the existing mental models, so the ones that are within, that users already hold of recommender systems, with the mental models that is expressed by the system. And with this, I would like to end this talk, and I would thank you very much for your attention. If you have any comments, ideas, or questions, please ask.